One scholar says Nate Mackey's entwined serial poem is, quote, the most ambitious and accomplished poetic effort of our time, and the major epic poem of a generation. Other scholars say his work is nerve-wracking to write about and requires a master sentence diagrammer, and also writing about his poetry music presents a challenge. One other scholar says there's something weirdly cultic in Mackey's work. Fortunately for the reader interested in investigating these claims and other deep perceptions of clearly one of the most important poets of our time, there is a new book of essays called Nathaniel Mackey, Destination Out, Essays on His Work. Jeanne Heuving is co-editor of Inciting Poetics, Thinking and Writing Poetry. She's a professor at the University of Washington, Bothell, a graduate faculty member in the English department at the University of Washington, Seattle, a Seattle native who still calls the Emerald City home, and editor of Destination Out. Jeanne, welcome back and congratulations on this brilliant new book. Stunning.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's
Thank you
fantastic.
for that great introduction and the detailing of the multiple perspectives.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff in the book. I read it with gusto and made many underlines in it and notes. However, you and I should make the disclaimer that we are both, in Mackey's words, hambonistas,
Aha!
meaning that we've had our own poems published in Hambone, the journal he's been editing since 1974. So that's full disclosure.
Full disclosure.
Okay. Tell us about how you first became aware of Nate Mackey's work.
That's an interesting question. I think I was introduced to it by the poet Joseph Donahue, who was very enthusiastic about it. And so I read some, and like many people, I was drawn to it, but I also had difficulty understanding it. And then I think the next place I became interested in it more intensely was I was writing the book, The Transmutation of Love and Avant-Garde Poetics. And I was looking for uh, poets who I thought in their intensity wrote a poetry at that equaled the intensity of love poetry of the past, but they wrote it differently because it was an archaic form of love poetry in which the lover, usually male, is pursuing a feminine beloved. So I found Nathaniel Mackey's work terrific. It has much intense eroticism in its sexuality. And indeed, in his criticism, he talks against the kind of pursuit poetry that I was attempting to show that an intense eros love poetry could exist apart from the pursuit poem. So that was one stage. And then happily, about that time, Paul Nelson invited Nathaniel Mackey to give a workshop and a lecture in Seattle. And so I was an interlocutor at an event, which got me more involved with the work. And every time I involved myself with the work, I felt this undertow, like this is really important. There's something done to you, to me, to a reader in reading it, which is hard to explain, but is a form of engagement that I have when I read the most significant, great poetry, that some depths were being tapped or some surface was being achieved that brought me as a reader into the work in a really powerful way. So those are kind of the steps. I want to make sure to include Paul in the steps, because it's always really helpful to meet a writer, specifically a difficult writer.
The book you referenced was the occasion for the last interview that you and I did.
Yes, thank you.
Highly recommended. I whipped it out again and went over your Mackey essay in that. And I have to tell you how validating it is for me to hear that when you first came across Nate's work, you were struggling with it. And someone with your brain power struggling with it makes me feel, okay, I'm not the I'm not the loser here, because trying to get a grip on it is a difficult thing. And so those notions of the initiation, according to one of the scholars in the book, Norman Finkelstein, an initiation is required to get into Mackey's work deeply. And so I appreciate his comment. And I think, and we will probably get into that comment, but we should immediately sever it from any of the negative associations of cults, because you can. It's not like the Hotel California. You can leave anytime you want. What was the first notion you had that there could be a book of essays that you'd edit about Mackey's work?
I became acquainted with many poets that were enthusiastic about his work, including you, Paul, but also several of the poets in this volume: Joseph Donahue, Norman Finkelstein, Rachel Duplessis, a graduate student, now an associate professor of mine, Paul Jawson, read his work and was instantly drawn to it. So suddenly it seemed that there was a group of people that were amassing around him. There were others, Maria Damon and Fred Moten. So this poet had a really impressive group of people who were devoted to his work. And there was talk of a collection of essays. And there was more talk of a collection of essays, and nobody seemed to be rising to the forefront. So I thought, I'd like to do that collection of essays. So I asked Nathaniel Mackey, because in many ways, some of the poets in the book have been reading his work longer than me. I would say I'm a dedicated reader for, I don't know, 7, 8 years, but some of these people have been reading his work for 20, 30 years. So I asked him, I said, what would you think if I edited this? And he said, great, go ahead. I checked with a couple of the other people I wanted in the book, and they also said, yeah, that would be great. We want someone to do this. So I was hooked.
Fantastic. How do you describe Nate's work for someone who's not read him?
That's a good question. In the book, in the introduction to the book, I talk about 4 different types of work. He's probably most famous for his poetry. He's done cross-genre work in fiction. And I frequently teach the cross-genre fiction work because it's more accessible. I also teach the poetry. The poetry I would describe as existing between music and language. I think if one picks it up and reads it as much a sound event as it is a meaning event, that it will be much more approachable. I also think there's many recordings of him reading his poetry, so that's a great entrance. In the book, I talk about the title Destination Out, which Nate describes, that's his terminology, destination out, as wanting to have all givens changed, or wanting to refuse all givens. So he talks about the centrifugal movement of that approach. And I add to that the centripetal, that he's actually creating a different interior as well as exterior. And as an African American who comes into language with all of the languages meant to situate, position African Americans according to any of a number of dominant narratives, whether negative racist notions or helpful progressive ideas of victimage or isolation of African American qualities from everyday life. So I think that one of the ways to look at his work is he's really working constantly against stereotypes, stereotypes that are embedded really deeply into language and discourse, and that he's creating a different idiom in which to write that avoids stereotypes, avoids static language, that avoids any kind of positioning that is compromising. So that would be how the between music and language poetry is really important. The fiction's much more kind of daring narratives, theoretical explorations, daring in the sense of superficially daring. It challenges discourse formations and and maybe does ethnographies occasionally. He says he thinks of it as liner notes to jazz. So the fiction, it's easier to see where the reaction as an African American writer is coming in. Poetry is pretty subtle. It's like saying about John Ashbery that he was a gay poet, but he never came out of the closet because he didn't want the fixture. I mean, he came out of the closet somewhere, someplace, but his writing wasn't out of the closet because it was, that would have been way too limited. So someone like Nathaniel Mackey, there's many references, rich resonances with African American cultures, history, particularly musics, the African diaspora in musics and histories. It's there as referenced and allusion, but there's not the position that I am an African American poet. And I think that's what's important about his poetry, but that's also what people need to recognize, that African American histories, cultures, music are really important, but he's engaging them. He's not positioning himself with respect to them. So,
A rejection of identity poetics.
yeah, yeah, basically realizing that identity uh, and the histories and cultures which create identities is determining. He refuses to play by its scripts, its fixed ideas.
More power to him, I think,
Yeah.
on that. As a person with a name like Paul E. Nelson, coming from a person with the name Lesbia Matilda Pino Roque de Nelson, whose ancestors come in part from the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, people would have certain notions of my identity from my last name and miss a lot of who I am because of that. So that Nate does this is a really joyous thing for me, with the caveat that there are people who feel that their tribe, however they determine it, has been so oppressed for so long that they feel the first step for them might be achieving that identity in the best way. But then I guess Nate's hope, and maybe my hope, would be that they could transcend that they could be all that and yet come from a position like Nate does, which I think is something to strive for.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. And sort of, the term open field, to open the field, not to reject identity, but not to be tied to it as a kind of stake.
Yeah, fantastic. One aspect you wrote about in the book, The Transmutation of Love and Avant-Garde Poetics, in that essay, Nathaniel Mackey in Black Sounds, is that he writes in a, quote, present past writing, which is useful in creating an alternative space and elsewhere, and that the uncertain temporality combines with its undetermined spatial location that intensifies its conveyance of the ecstatic. No time, no place, at least not a time and place of which we can be certain. Um, can you talk a little bit about this? I think the key phrase in that question, present, past writing, and a place that we can't nail down on Google Maps or any other service.
Right. Thanks. It was a while reading him that I realized how much of the poetry was actually in the past tense. And I can't say whether all of it is now, because he's just published some big books. I haven't, because the illusion in reading it is that it's present tense. And then if you begin to look at it, it is past tense. So that's the dislocation. If it was firmly past tense, that would be a different kind of poetry. And so I would say that's just another measure that he's taken consciously, deliberately, or unconsciously as a means of writing that frees up a space to write and say what and how he wants to say it. Uh, so it's an ambiguous temporality. And he has a number of fictional places, geographies, such as lone coast or low forest, um, which conjure more of a mood than they conjure, oh, I know that place, Lone Coast. He's talking about California ocean, you know. One of the writers in the book insists that the Lone Coast is the Gulf of Mexico. And I said, I really don't think so. She refused to change it.
Oh, so you did discuss that. That's interesting because I saw the dissonance in that, and getting to know where Lone Coast is,
Mm.
California, and then reading Rachel's essay and thinking, didn't they see the discrepancy in this? But if she wanted to keep it there, more power to her.
I know, I was surprised. I just thought, well, it's a minimal thing. And, he's written about Lone Coast for years when he lived in California. So, but maybe for him, Lone Coast is any coast, any waterway where one feels alone. But I think it has some moorage in Pacific Ocean.
Yes, in the low forest, North Carolina. But asking him might elicit the answer he gave me to a question once, which is only the shadow knows. There was an interesting footnote too that Rachel Blau Duplessis had about Norman Finkelstein's essay, which I talked to him about that, and he said she might be alluding to an earlier essay of his that he published many years ago, I think in the Splay Anthem era, in which he's talking about Mackey's shamanism. But that's an interesting thing to review for people who go to her footnotes, essay number 5. But back on the placelessness and timelessness, I'm reminded when I was a young broadcaster in Chicago, interviewing Wynton Marsalis, being so embarrassed by him showing how ignorant I was. Of course, he was raised by a jazz legend, and I was raised by a railroad guy. So I think he had an advantage there. But he was getting dressed in his hotel room before performing at Chicago Fest, and he was putting on these yellow shoes. And he said to me, "See that? Yellow shoes? Not many cats get away with that." And I think that many cats get away with this present past kind of temporality, this placeless temporality. I think of Olson in Projective Verse talking about the present tense being the tense of the mythic, and yet Mackey has gone beyond that to create this. How did you put it again? You put it a present hyphen past writing. So not many motherfuckers get away with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the fact that I had to kind of actually go in rather than impression that the words were creating on me, say, but wait a minute, all this is in the past tense. And the doubleness of that, I think, is the real achievement.
Yeah. Back to Rachel's essay, she refers to the key moment in the conception of the serial poem, and I don't think we've talked about this. There are two threads that go through it: Song of the Ondumbulu and Mu. And the Song of the Ondumbulu is from the Dogon tribe, an African tribe, and it's an elegy to apparently rough draft human beings, and in a way that can be seen as us. But she talks about that moment, um, an important moment, and maybe you can relate that to people who are watching this.
Yeah, the rough draft of a human being is Nathaniel Mackey's paraphrase of what Song of the Andambulu signify. But the actual Song of the Andambulu is a recording of a Dogon funereal chant that one can actually locate on Pen Sound if you go to the very end of the Nathaniel Mackey recordings. And it's a really powerful, disturbing acoustic experience. Nathaniel Mackey encountered it, I believe, when he was a DJ at a radio station in Los Gatos, California. And he encountered it in their library. And when he was a DJ there, he played both what might be called ethnographic music as well as very current jazz, maybe into new music stuff occasionally. So that became a basis for the Song of the Antubulu, which operates through the vision of imperfect human beings, suffering human beings, but also willfully wrong human beings. So one of the debates in the book is how utopian or dystopic is this book, with a sense that they really rub together. So Rachel actually sees that the draft of the imperfect human being, that what Nate Mackey is really holding in his mind is the very possibility of the perfection of the human, whereas other writers would emphasize more the dystopic or negational aspects of the work.
Mm-hmm. And then the Mu side of things refers to the notion of muthos. It refers to a record by Don Cherry, who was a contemporary and collaborator with Ornette Coleman, played the pocket trumpet. And so the Mu part refers to the mythic. It in fact refers to the lost continent of Lemuria, so which is not covered in the book. I don't think there's one mention of Lemuria, which is interesting, and perhaps is a thread for future scholars, because I don't think this has been followed up very much, but it has been mentioned in connection with this. So maybe you can speak to the Mu side of the twin-themed serial effort.
Okay. The Mu side is more what he paraphrases when says, sort of lingual and erotic allure. And sometimes it's hard for me to distinguish a difference between Song of the Ant and Bulu and Moo, more so in the late work, where he says that he's actually braiding and fraying these, although there's a definite distinction continuing. Some poems are called Song of the Ant and Bulu, some are called Moo. I think Moo more often leads one into eroticism or the eros in the work. And there's more often an exploration of fulfillment as opposed to deprivation. So
A happy ending is what you're saying.
or a happiness in the middle, if not in the end.
Oh, there you go. There you go. And moo, the first two letters in the word musk, which is a word that comes up often in this context as well. So we'll let people figure out what that means exactly. And moo, by the way, I should add, is also means in Japanese nothingness, and is the brand of a very delectable sake, which I would recommend very, very highly, which they have at Uwajimaya, just in case you're wondering if you'd like a taste of that. Duplessis also calls Mackey's work socio-cosmological. So here's where I call you in with that brain power that I admire so much, to help break that down for people people who look at a word like that and start getting glazed eyes a little bit. What do you think she means by that?
Well, one of the debates in the book is critics that really want to anchor the work in metaphysical or spiritual associations, connections, although not exclusively. And many of the writers, the majority, who simply assume that the main reference point is social, so that even if there's metaphysical or esoteric references, that ultimately the work is operating in and through social relations. So I think Rachel, who is always a capacious and thorough critic, is trying to capture both of those. So the cosmic or say the term again, socio-cosmological.
That's
okay,
right.
the socio is where most of us live and assume that we're not religious particularly, or if we are religious, we assume that the social or the socio aspect of our lives is pretty all-encompassing. The cosmological means that Nathaniel Mackey reaches out into the esoteric, the metaphysical, etc., and that those aspects of his work need to be named. And that's a pretty ardent group of poets and critics who really want to stay that. Nathaniel Mackey, when I interviewed him, said both. His work is meant to open into both. So Rachel has it right, socio-cosmological.
She might get some arguments from other people in the book. No, Peter O'Leary, you think?
Yeah. He would just say that what really is driving Nathaniel Mackey is the mythological, which has been repressed or denied. But even Peter has a pretty abstract definition of mythological, which has more to do with the proclamation of truth rather than what we typically do in the 21st and the 20th century, which is merely to account how things are. So it's the proclamation of insisting on that this is how I see something, this is reality. and that those boring historical accounts, or accounts that can be boring, are actually missing the drive or the energy zone for the concrete or the deliberately material aspects of our existence.
Not many cats can get away with being socio-cosmological and dirty at the same time. To use Peter O'Leary's words, that Mackey doesn't get enough credit for being dirty. That's how he said that. So the socio-cosmological and the get down with your bad self all in the same. I don't even know if that's. I don't think that's even a question. I think that's just a statement.
I was going to say I would use the word dirty, but I guess if if that's O'Leary's term, sexual detail, pretty specific. Some,
There are so many neologisms in Mackey's work. A review of them could be its own book, or at least its own chapter. Insofari, insofarian, nonsonance, ithm, YTHM, and whatsayer among them. I love whatsayer especially. I'm thinking of what was it? Ohio Players, roller coaster of love. Say what? So the what sayer is there in the Ohio Players. Tell us about that. That's got to be a scholar's dream, just to start digging into that stuff. No?
Yeah, it's reading Nate Mackey's pretty great because he leaves a lot of clues, and also in his interviews he has terrific discussions. And I would say if there was anything intimidating to creating this book, or for critics writing on the book, is how so explicit he can be about his own work. And he's really explicit about the whatsayer. The whatsayer comes from Ellen Basso's description of a specific African group, and I'm not remembering it. But the whatsayer is that there is always a person and entity for any communication to occur that is the whatsayer. And the whatsayer asks questions, or the whatsayer says, so what, to anything that's said. So there's kind of, in the work, or in Nathaniel Mackey, there's this constant questioning, really, of so what? And so there's a whatsayer who can be quite brutal. And one of my favorite moments in a poem, I believe it's in What Said Serif, is after this, an extended passage, and the whatsayer comes in and says, so what?
And of course, Miles Davis from Kind of Blue. There's a tune. So what?
Yeah,
Um,
which
page,
is part of that. I think
yeah,
why he likes whatsayer so much.
yeah.
It's a great so what song.
Ellen B. Basso, A Musical View of the Universe. In order for a story to be told at all, it must be received by a responder or whatsayer, who's a crucial actor in the situation. The whatsayer may be someone who asks to be given the narrative or the recipient of a story that exemplifies explanatory principles needing clarification during the course of some other discussion. The person serving as the whatsayer can change during the course of a telling. Page 20 of the book. All right, yeah. Um, uh, the next question I had, is it hard to write about his work? You just answered that, and it was mentioned in several different places. Maria Damon, with one quote, saying, "Write about Mackey's poetry music presents a challenge." Rachel Blau Duplessis, nerve-wracking to write about. And it was Peter O'Leary's quote about a specific line: "A master sentence diagrammer is needed for that particular sentence." And so all those, I think, give people a sense of that. Um, One thing mentioned in the book a few times, not gotten into at all, is Hambone. We talked about that at the beginning of the interview. Hambone is a journal that he's edited on and off from 1974, took a hiatus until 82, and has produced many copies of that. I think his method is fantastic. He um, gets in touch with some of his friends and some of his new associates and says, "Send me some work," and publishes what he thinks is good. I think that's a great model for creating journals, and that's the way he does it. But Hambone not mentioned too much in the book.
Right. It gets mentioned as one of his curatorial activities, and there have been several. Just he has um, he's curated a set of essays on Wilson Harris. There's the radio program that I mentioned, and there's also a book of jazz poetry where he creates an anthology along with another editor of poetry that is jazz centric. But yeah, Hambone is probably his most sustained and maybe most important curatorial project. And I think that I was thrilled when he asked me to send him some work. This was after the Paul Nelson event. And um, I think his idea in the journal is to, as Paul said, to choose work that he thinks is really good. But it's also to create a community. So anyone who's ever been published in it gets to have the identity of being a Hambonista. And so both Paul and I are Hambonistas. How many people have been published by him? Uh, he started publishing this in 1974. There was a hiatus, began again in 1982. And he probably publishing it once a year, maybe more often, maybe less often. One thing that he does, which I think is great, is he just accumulates enough work till it's time to publish another Hambone. And so there's an essay on it in one of his books, Paracritical Hinge, for people that are interested. But probably the best example is just to look at the issues. Great people in it, in addition to Paul and me, of course. uh,
Yeah,
Kamo Brothwaite
Mhm.
is published therein frequently.
Mhm.
Louis Chotsukai, an interesting new writer, has just published a book. Um, Rachel Duplessis, Maria Damon, and many of the people that wrote on him have been published in Hambone, but probably at least 1,000 different writers over time. Maybe that's too many, but many.
Yeah. I if you want to go to identity, I identify as a Hambonista. I'm very
Yeah.
happy to identify it that way. Adelaide Morris says that the given of Mackey's work is, quote, "Black historical stolen harvest, black historical sweat," quoting Nate, that his work peaks at this historical moment is rather consequential. He's taking on assumptions of the dominance of Eurocentrism, while that tradition's most powerful representative might be the former president. And his organization is to be indicted tomorrow, according to news reports this morning. When does this understanding trickle down to the soccer mom voting in the suburbs of the United States of America? I mean, this is clearly the truth as you and I see it. That his work has to be seen in the context of Black historical stolen harvest, Black historical sweat. In Canada, now with the discovery of mass graves of Indigenous children outside schools where they were forced to lose their culture and they were tortured and killed, is Canada's attempt to awaken to the horrors that have happened to Indigenous people. When we're seeing it now in the avant-garde of North American letters and someone like Nate Mackey, how long does that take to trickle down to the average person to understand that is the truth and the substrate of this continent?
Well, that's a really good question. I just want to point out that as early as his first fiction book, which I believe was published in 1982, Bedouin Hornbook, all of the ills that have come to light are clearly identified. The police chokehold, the sense of the African American church being the heartbreak church coming from the chains of slavery. So, and that's not new to him, but just to sometimes because of the centrifugal out aspects of the work, people are not always identifying in its work how firmly it's rooted in African American injustice. But as does the theorist Fred Moten, who found a great deal in Mackey. Mackey is a previous generation. Representing this stuff ad nauseum, does not lead to a better life, either for the person writing or speaking it, or for the culture at large. The current protests, in terms of actually changing people's minds and attitudes, are extremely hopeful, simply because the mass seems to be changing their mind. And why it's taken so long? I mean, we went through the Jim Crow South, just a horrible thing. I mean, I think it's partly because that in the South, like you can see it now in voter suppression, there is a need for white supremacy. And there's an unconscious privilege, as has been said again and again, of white supremacy, of which all whites get advantaged by, whether you like it or not. It's true, dealing with a policeman, I'm in a much better position probably if stopped on a road than an African American, or just much more subtle kinds of judgments that go on. So I hope things are changing, but there's a big backlash, and who and how that backlash will continue to affect things by electing people like Donald Trump, second Donald Trump possible. I mean, Biden barely won the Electoral College. The Electoral College advantages Southern regressive states. The Senate advantages regressive politics. And so it's scary.
Wow, well said. Well said. Um, Despite the racial overtones and the undercurrent in Mackey's work, you think part of his message is that we are all fugitives when it comes to the reach of corporations, white supremacist governments, and other structures, and even the very climate system being assaulted by the requirements of capitalism. I felt like a fugitive in my own house when it was 108 degrees here a couple of days ago, 104, which had been the record before that, and 100 the day before that, in a town that when I came in 1988 had never seen a day over 100. So are we all fugitives, Jeanne?
Yes. I mean, capitalism, which, it's hard to imagine a world outside of it, but it has really bred irresponsible relations. And these relations have continued. And I say it's hard to imagine a world without out of it, just partly the pragmatics of, of course, more social governments, more ways of mitigating against it would help. But it's hard to imagine because an overturn of one economic system that does really well on supply and demand if you have the money to pay for things. Sort of the horrors, at least that I grew up with, the notions of how maybe the Soviet economy failed in various ways, how China turned toward capitalism. You know, some of these stories can't be completely forgotten. There's different ways of doing capitalism, which has to be affected. And if there was something different than capitalism that worked, I would certainly be for it.
Mhm.
But we're definitely captive. I mean, captive every time I turn on my computer and I get advertisements that I cannot help but get.
Mhm.
You know, that's from a captivity, and the environment is really scary, you know.
I think we've heard that tone about 8 times coming into your computer during this interview.
I know, I'm really sorry. I have not been able to figure out the arrival of email, maybe because I have a university system and I don't control it.
Yeah.
I don't know, I've tried.
It's not a big deal. Cooperative capitalism certainly is something that has to be considered. And there's a bar here in the neighborhood, Jude's, that is going to employee-owned system, and these are real signs of hope. And I'm at core an optimistic person. Mark Fisher, I think it was, in a book I think was called "Is There No Alternative?" Turning around the Thatcher Reagan, there is no alternative, said that more people in our world today can envision the biblical apocalypse more than they can an end to capitalism. So I think that speaks to your feeling about how it's difficult to envision something else. Is Mackey's work the most successful world poem that Robert Duncan had envisioned? I know that Mackey says it's not a world poem. Don't call it that. It's not holistic. But do you think it is?
I think I would go with his equivocation about a world poem because it suggests it's totalizing and complete. And I think that the one of the great qualities of his work is that it's provisional contingent. And so the fact that it incorporates many different cultures and certainly different musics from different cultures is terrific and means that it's more of a world poem than Ezra Pound's cantos. But I wouldn't say that, you know.
Yeah, the cross-cultural nature of the work is certainly inspiring and something that could open up many different rabbit holes if you went into it. I did a Spotify playlist based on the new book. I was going to call it the new record.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, Sonic Perfume, I think it's called on Spotify.
Really?
If you go to Spotify search and go Sonic Perfume, Nate Mackey, you can see a lot of Anthony Braxton and anything that I could find that was referenced in the book. And I haven't finished the double trio I put in there, and I think I put So What on the list too, so you can hear that. Um, what do you hope that people take from this book, the book that you just edited, that is just now out, that you should be very proud of, that will open people's heads up, that is extremely well done? That, you know, Jeanne, I think this is the most important poetry work being done on the planet right now, to give us some sense of how to get into the depth of this and be part of the cult. What do you hope that people take from this?
Okay. Well, I, you know, first of all, I am, compared to many of the critics, a relative newcomer. As I said, I've been reading the work seriously for, I don't know, 6, 7, maybe 8 years. So I was encouraged to write an introduction that would introduce the work for people just newly coming to it, but would also be adequate for people who were very involved with it. So that was a double demand. So I would say, read my introduction if you're newly coming to the work. And then I briefly summarize each of the essays. And I would say, go to the essay that piques your interest. I think there's many different doors into his work. And find the door that engages you as the reader. Better to be closely and deeply engaged than trying to encompass or have a comprehensive sense. If you want a comprehensive sense, try some fiction, try some poetry, try some um, of his interviews. I mean, those are really terrific, as they're all over the place, but there's many in the book, Paracritical Hinge. And again, I would bring up Ashbery. For those people who tried to make meaning out of Ashbery, that's not where Ashbery, first of all, I'm not sure Nate Mackey's totally on the board with Ashbery. So apologies to Nate Mackey if he listens to this. But it's really the poetry is a progressive listening, that it's best to go with the flow and then go back if you have questions or thoughts, but to accept that it is really written between music and language, and to experience it partially as music, as an unfolding experience. That would be my recommendation on the poetry.
Well, just a delight to be able to engage you in this way. I'm very grateful for this access to your bright mind and grateful for the work that you do on contemporary poetry. It's a tremendous gift, and I enjoyed the book very, very much. Made numerous notes in it for potential talking points, and we probably could do 3 hours, but it takes a lot of energy to be in this situation, and I'm grateful for yours today, Jeanne. I wish you continued success.
I want to thank you for having read the book, both Nathaniel Mackey's work and also this book of essays so closely. It was a pleasure to talk to you about the book.